Die Gedanken sind frei.
My thoughts freely flower.
Die Gedanken sind frei.
The purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei.
I think as I please.
Hello, my name is Hugh Henry. Welcome to Freethought Forum. Today we're with Nick Calzoncit, and we're going to talk about eugenics, a scientific darkness, past and present. Nick has a Bachelor of Science in Elementary Education and a Master of Science in Deaf Education from Gallaudet University. He participated in the World Tobacco Conference of the United Nations, presented at the World Tobacco Control Conference in San Francisco, and was honored by President Clinton at the White House. Nick recently became interested in eugenics and is trying to get a consideration for changing the names of schools named after American eugenicists, especially Burbank. I also happen to know he's the host of 2 programs on community television. So, Nick, tell us about the darkness of eugenics.
Thank you very much, Hugh. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to make reference to, and you don't really have to look carefully at this, Edwin Black's book, War on the Weak. That's how my interest started. Last year, I heard about Mr. Black's book and how it was making bestseller lists almost immediately. And that led to the interest in eugenics. I immediately started to look, and this is important. There is a wealth of information on eugenics. I didn't know that, but there are countless books available, readily available, and of course the internet, you would never exhaust the information that's available there. So it's a world interest. For some reason, and I want to point that out, is that the media today does not have a real big interest in making eugenics something that's known by the everyday person. Well, this is the story as an overview taken from Mr. Black's book. The actual movement started in 1904 in New York in one of Carnegie Institute's enterprises. A group of scientists, American scientists, and interestingly, they're not named in the book, but a small group of scientists got together to discuss the idea of developing or producing a world race of people who were, and this is described many times, Nordic. They wanted to make people, only people who had blue eyes and blonde hair. That's also interesting because every country has people, even the Scandinavian countries, and have people who are not blonde and blue-eyed. So they were considered possible targets too. The idea was to eliminate people who were not ideal Nordics. And eliminate meant a lot of things. First of all, there were people who were had a handicap of any one of a number of things. If you were blind, or deaf, or feeble, anything that was a handicap, physically or mentally, was to be eliminated. Now, an example of the extremes that this was carried to, if I had a vision problem and it was determined, then in some places it was ruled that not only was I to be somehow removed, but every member of my family who may have had 20/20 vision, they had to go too. So it was that extreme. Now there are a number of things that were done, different kinds of things that were done to eliminate people. For sure, some were sterilized. Many people, 60,000 Americans were sterilized. And obviously, well, women were sterilized. There were people that were virtually imprisoned. They were cut away from society. There were laws that said you couldn't marry if you had a potential of producing a child who might be non-Nordic. So there were a number of, any way that you could think of to eliminate people was actually carried out. There were 27 states in the United States which passed laws to help control people. One of the biggest things, there are a number of people who are highly well respected worldwide, not alive today. Well, there probably are some alive today that we don't know about yet, but these are some people. I'm going to list you some names. The one that I hold most important, and I'll tell you why in just a second, is the Supreme Court Judge Holmes, and I'll tell you a little bit about him, but Alexander Graham Bell, Winston Churchill, Woodrow Wilson, Margaret Sanger, extremely important. Luther Burbank was another. And from those, I'd like to pick the Supreme Court Judge Holmes and tell you about him first. An interesting thing is that most of these people who were strong supporters of eugenics were well-to-do, well-educated, the elite. They were not, some of them maybe weren't really highly educated and highly intelligent, but they were the elite. They were people with money. Now, Holmes was raised in a family that was very well-to-do. He himself was a Harvard scholar. He's a brilliant man. His family were all well-educated. His dad was a state judge. As he grew up, he had in his home every day of his life world-famous intellects, writers mainly, Emerson, Longfellow, just a lot of people who were there every day. Melville was in there, lived across the street. So he had this kind of a bringing up, which I think is important. He also is respected as one of the highest respected judges of all times. He had more than approximately 1,000 cases that he ruled on, that he authored, that are looked at by the whole world as being ideal things. Interesting also, there's so many interesting things in this area, is his biggest area of concern was freedom of speech, which I see a relationship there, and Black points that out. Black dedicates this book to a number of people, but also to the people who were never born, people who, as a result of eugenics, never came to be. And in a sense, I tie that into Holmes with freedom of speech as being the biggest thing of his life, the greatest defender of it, but at the same time, he eliminated the possibility of freedom of speech for countless people. There was a young girl, a teenager, 16-year-old girl in Virginia named Carrie Buck. Now, she was very carefully selected. Her mom had been not mentally ill, but borderline intellectually. So somebody selected her daughter, Carrie, and made this person the target. This is the prime person that we're going to use to promote eugenics. And they declared her incompetent and feeble-minded, and Holmes ruled at the United States Supreme Court that she was in fact an imbecile and she had to be put away. We found out later that she was mentally average. She wasn't brilliant, but there was nothing wrong with her. Her sister, who was brought into the equation, was fine, went through school, got good grades and everything. Two things there. It shows the meanness of finding somebody, no matter what the cost, to do this. And secondly, that they made a mistake. They didn't care whether she was sick or not. Another extremely important person is Churchill. Churchill is interesting for a number of reasons. He's defined as a radical eugenist. There's no question about that. But one of the things that is unusual is after the war, World War II, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin signed an agreement that those horrible people from the Holocaust, we three people, including Churchill, are going to do everything in our power for the rest of our lives to punish these people, to see that they come before the courts. Churchill was involved in the situation, so I see there that there's a hypocrisy, if you will, which is shocking to say Churchill a hypocrite? Well, anyway, that's in here. The movement I told you started in New York, and it grew very rapidly. The Rockefeller Foundation and Carnegie provided a lot of money. IBM, when Hitler became interested, Hitler learned, you're hearing me right, Hitler learned about eugenics from Americans. The Holocaust was impacted by American eugenics, as horrible as that sounds. IBM, which was the world's leading computer company, contributed. They offered to Hitler and did in fact, I think they got paid for it, but they did in fact provide systems whereby people could be executed systematically and with some order and with less than in disarray. That's a shocking thing that's hard to believe. Alexander Graham Bell, I happen to know about him because of my training in deafness. Gallaudet is the only university in the world for the deaf. They take a few hearing people who want to work with deafness. But Bell was considered a role model for deaf people. He did a lot of things. But he also was a eugenist. I was trained in deafness. I was trained to learn about Alexander Graham Bell. But nobody ever told me that he wanted to kill people or eliminate people. I learned it here last year. Woodrow Wilson was the governor of New Jersey, and New Jersey was one of the first states to enact laws to control people, and was very aggressive in that. A very important person is Margaret Sanger. We all know her, and this is extremely important for San Antonio, regardless of your stand on abortion, because we have a very active abortion program in San Antonio. Margaret Sanger was an incredible woman. First of all, she was highly intelligent, and there was no pushing her around. So she was very outspoken, but she was outspoken on a woman's right to make the final decision. And so abortion was a big thing. And people were afraid to even tangle with her. Even the eugenists said, no, leave her alone. She's going to cause us more trouble. But anyway, she was an extreme eugenist. And one big difference is that she did not want the elite, the rich. She didn't want them to have babies either. She wanted them to have abortions, where the eugenists on the other side didn't carry their campaign to that degree. Luther Burbank is a botanist, certainly a world genius. He could make plants do anything he wanted them to do. I got interested in him. You ought to read about him. He was an incredible intellect. Well, he was a eugenist, a very serious eugenics. And he made the comparison that in American society we have all the good things that happen, but then we have criminals, and we have imbeciles, and we have handicapped people. And he called those the weeds of society. Being a botanist, he was talking about the flowers and the beauty and the plants with all the good things, but then when it came to the unfortunate, those were the weeds. Now, I'm going to close. Well, there's a couple of things that I really want to say quickly. Eugenics had a name change, and it's in here. It tells you the name went from eugenics to genetics. Now, we know the word, we think we know the word genetics, and that is used readily. We have Southwest Research here in San Antonio that does work in genetics. I don't know what it is they do, which is sometimes a problem because we don't always know what they do. They may be doing some good things. I have no idea. But it is eugenics. It is the same as a carryover from here. There are other things that bother me a whole lot. We know about the AIDS epidemic in Africa, and now today we're hearing about birds and the carrying of diseases in China. Now, there are some people, and I started thinking about it last year, there are some people who think that AIDS was introduced for the purpose of eliminating people. And certainly millions of people are dying from it. And there is some question as to whether countries like America and other countries that have power, are these countries doing enough to truly try to set that off. And finally, I want to people to consider. We have many schools. In San Antonio, we have Holmes High School. We have Wilson. We have Burbank. We have Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. So I would like to, I have suggested and want to consider informing those people, the students, the boards of trustees, that is it right to have a school named after a eugenist, a person that it was intended to eliminate most of us. That's almost everybody. So with that, I'd like to really thank Hugh again, and we want to share some time together. I've learned a lot from him in this last couple of days, so I'd like to do that. So if we might be able to discuss, I know I may have left out some things, and you certainly have some ideas.
A lot of people don't know that Woodrow Wilson, when he came to the White House, was shocked to discover that there were not separate restroom facilities for whites and blacks, something he remedied immediately.
I didn't know that.
Something a lot of people don't know about him. Nick, what do you mean by an extreme eugenist?
Extreme? Did I use that term?
Yeah.
Okay. Well...
or eugenics. Extreme eugenics, yeah.
Yeah. I don't remember using it, but it brings a thought to mind. The difference that I made between Sanger and I think maybe that's where I used it. Sanger wanted a woman to have power. That was her thing, and abortion was one of the things. Now, but she also said the rich and elite women, the women of education, they too should have abortions. They must avoid having children, or if they're pregnant, get rid of them. Where the eugenists on the other side excluded that one point. So I saw that as a difference.
One of the things I've seen in the literature on this is that there was a difference in immigration around this time. That during the 19th century, the immigration was from Northern Europe. But as we went into the 20th century, we got people from Eastern Europe whose habits and appearance were quite different from Northern Europeans. And of course, there was also an extreme prejudice against the Chinese on the West Coast. Now, there's a book out. I should have remembered to write it down. The thought is that eugenics had its heyday in the 30s and 40s. But the book says no, the golden age of eugenics was actually the 50s. And I have some material that is shockingly recent. Colorado routinely sterilized the mentally ill before 1960. And it talks about here, the day before they came to me and said, tomorrow you're going to the hospital ward. And she said, why? So we can operate on you. What for? So you can't have children. What could I say? What could I have done? I was a minor. That was May of 1941. The Denver Lunacy Commission labored her mentally ill. The judge ordered her to the Colorado hospital in Pueblo for treatment. Then it talks about, yet it was her willingness to step forward in court 41 years ago in a lawsuit she filed against 3 state hospital administrators that provides the only evidence that Colorado ever sterilized as a routine procedure. Testimony during the 1958 trial revealed that for more than 30 years, beginning in the 20s, doctors at Colorado's primary mentally ill institution robbed dozens of women of their fertility, even though the state never had a law allowing it. Nationwide, tens of thousands of people, mostly the young mentally ill women, were sterilized prior to the 1970s under state laws upheld by the Supreme Court.
There's 2 things there on what you said that I'd like to cover. The immigration change that you talked about is true. And these eugenics that we were talking about in the 1910, 1915, around the time that you're talking about, they identified target populations. For sure, the Jews had to go, blacks, and all these others, but they included Mexicans in Texas. So we actually had that here. I've not been able to get into that yet, but I'm going to. And yes, I worked at the state hospital here in the 60s, late 60s. And since I saw you last, I remembered that cigarettes were provided for the mental patients, and they were encouraged to smoke. They were taught how to roll them, and of course they died from cigarettes. And the thought came, there are many eugenics type things that we don't stop to think about. It was easier for the person to die. The hospital had one less person to handle. So that's another point.
There was another item I gave you from the Native American population. Apparently, the Indian Medical Service, which is a tiny branch of NIH. I've worked with these guys a couple of times. They're a very small outfit. But they continue to sterilize Indians, Native Americans, not necessarily with their consent, apparently. This is from Australia. Report released yesterday claims that more than 1,000 legal sterilizations have been performed on intellectually disabled women and girls. Always women they go after. Apparently there was, since the High Court in 1992, the only court tribunal that could authorize sterilization, and there are only 17 authorized, despite figures showing that 1,045 girls, this is since 1992, have been sterilized during this period. The law has failed to protect significant numbers of children from significant abuse of their fundamental right and bodily integrity. So this is going on right now.
Yes, sir, right
in
now.
Australia.
Yeah, without any doubt about it. The point that you made about why not men, and that's an interesting thing. All of the eugenists, the original people in the 1904, with two exceptions, were men, and there were a lot of them. There were scientists from all over the country that eventually got together. But there were some women, and interestingly enough, and this is the point, is that the women were very, very powerful, intelligent, educated people. Sanger was one, and Harriman was another, a very powerful family in New York at the time.
The Averil Harriman is the most.
Yeah, exactly. See, and that, I don't know what that means, but it's an element that needs consideration.
Something I spoke to you before the program about that came to me. I've got more on women here. Is that this is the same sort of pattern you see with serial killers, beginning with Jack the Ripper, who seemed to have a medical background from what he did, and what wonders if Jack the Ripper had, since he's post-Darwin, if he had some kind of eugenic idea. Always the targets are prostitutes or college girls, loose college girls. The Green River Killer, the Red Light Bandit. If there's something underlying all this stuff, I don't know. I don't really know if there is.
That's another point, is we don't know, but there's so much there. The prostitutes and that sort of thing. We have, and I pointed out to you, we have that here at the border. There are 60 women who have been murdered, and suspected that many more that we haven't found the bodies, but they were pretty much prostitutes. The same kind of a serial killer as you're talking about. And there was another point that slipped my mind. It might come back to me in just a second.
Well, another thing is that this seems to me close to rape, which is not a sexual crime. It's a crime of violence that involves sex. And this kind of thing tends to look like rape. Let me go on to, this was something that was covered on the NPR or public television, I forget which. This is red deer in Alberta, Canada. The provincial school for the mentally deficient in red deer. Virtually everyone who entered it was deemed to have inferior genes and was forcibly sterilized. The Red Deer School was implementing a law that had been on the statute book since 1928. The law was not repealed until 1972. It didn't matter what the terrified child said. The verdict was nearly always the same: sterilization. Plus, like the Magdalen laundry thing in Ireland, these women were locked up permanently, never allowed out. In fact, the people of Red Deer felt so badly about it that when children or women managed to escape from the facility, they concealed them and tried to help them get away. And this, as I said, in 1972, and certainly in my lifetime and yours.
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. There's a couple of other things that I'd like to just quickly and get covered, repeated. And we only have 4 minutes or so. The fact that I mentioned it earlier, I don't want to be the one to judge, but I would like for those school districts, for the Board of Trustees, to consider, to learn about eugenics. And if a school was named after a eugenist, then the board ought to consider changing the name. Now, I've carried the idea to a greater degree. I'd like it to be a very democratic thing, that it should not be just the school board doing it, but that staff and students and parents look into it and learn. I would not send my child to somebody who wanted to kill my child, and I think that there would be a lot of people like that. And finally, there is a need in San Antonio. We have a lot of problems with our schools. Our schools don't score as high, students don't score as high as they should. And I think one of the reasons is we should change the names of these schools to really great world famous people who achieved on a world basis. Now, some school districts do that, but almost none. And then you would teach the student, if he went to that school and he would have to learn about this great person, that would be motivation for that student. So we would be doing two things, getting rid of the name of the eugenist and promoting positive.
I've got one last piece.
Okay.
From August 1997 in Stockholm. Historians have been hushed up for years. Shock Swedes have learned that more than 60,000 women were sterilized to rid the society of, quote, inferior racial types and to encourage Aryan features. This is a program that was started in 1946, when I was born, and was not stopped until 1976. So what you were talking about is happening now. Now, I'm a student of the dark side of science, and this is certainly the dark side of science. It's also an example that science can get dogmatic like religion. But what really disturbs me about this is that these people had no chance at all. The entire system was against them. It talks about a girl writing frantically letters to her relatives that were intercepted.
It's endless. The examples that can be cited are endless of the horrors that actually took place.
And taking place recently.
Yes.
And we don't know if they continue to take place. And we don't know if they would take place in the future.
I think it's likely, and I don't know whether we have a minute or so, but very quickly, I do tobacco control work, and we now have documented that by 2020 there will be 10 million people dying from tobacco, and that's going to keep increasing. So I get the thought that somehow eugenics became involved in this. It's far-fetched, but eugenists can do anything.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
Apparently so. Well, this is Hugh Henry for Freethought Forum. This has been Nick Calzoncit, and we've been talking about eugenics, the dark side of science. Thank you very much.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei, no